Hello, everyone, and welcome to Concordia University's Force Space. Thank you for joining us for the final installment for today's event, Symbiotic Futures, which is a pop-up expo and roundtable with the Critical Materiality Mediation Series. So here at Force Space, we work with our university community to help mobilize knowledge by co-creating daily activities to examine research questions and projects in development across the university. We are running today's event as a live stream to YouTube and Zoom meeting. So for those of you joining us on Zoom, we welcome your questions with a raised hand or via the chat. And for those of you in the space, we welcome your questions as well. If you'd like to participate, just let us know by raising a hand, and we'll be sure to get the microphone to you. So we would like to begin by acknowledging that Concordia University is located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. And so with that, I will hand things off for the final time to the Associate Professor of Design and Computation Arts, Concordia University's Research Chair in Critical Practices in Materials and Materiality, Dr. Alice Géry. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Birdie, for the introduction. So thank you, Birdie, for the introduction. The second panel for today is entitled Prototyping Future Imaginaries. And we have Elena Thomas, Rome Fraser, Elie Desjardins, Oliver Sutherland, Sasha Loveless, and Matt Alpeny. Okay, together around this table, looking at natural world, longevity of water systems, waste, contamination, landscape, behavior, materiality, and sustainability. So maybe we start the same way we started with the other panel, and you delve a little bit more in the process and the concept and the methods and the materials of each project, just to situate our audience and also trace back the journey that led us here at Ford Space. Elena, do you want to start? Yeah.
Okay, we have slides here. Okay, so my project, for those of you who are here before, is the kind of underwater periscope project. So this is just a little cardboard prototype that I made using pre-cut makeup mirrors, which involved going to a lot of pharmaprix, etc., to find the right size. But I would say overall the project was really inspired by this personal experience that I had going to my local harbor, where I saw all the floating docks had been removed for the winter season, and there were hundreds of dead starfish that had been living on the bottom of the dock that were just out dying, which was pretty heartbreaking. And it just really struck me that there's all of these more than human living entities that, since we can't visibly see them, we don't have the same appreciation for them, the same empathy for them. So it really inspired me to change that. So I was talking to Alice a bit about my project, and we kind of, I started thinking about how I can make something living under a floating dock, like a starfish, visible to someone above the water without needing to actually put on scuba gear to go underneath the surface themselves. So that's kind of where this project was born. So the materiality in my instance is more like the sort of subaquatic world and all of the living entities within it, versus like a focus on the actual materials that I was using for my fabrication. After speaking a lot to the wood shop, the metal shop, and thinking about what I could do, I've worked a lot with biomaterials, ocean-based biomaterials, chitosan and alginate, which is like made from algae. I really love working with those materials, but they're really difficult to waterproof because they mostly have water in them. So that was kind of a difficult design decision for me. was to opt to use like less natural materials. It's something that I would love to consider in future projects, if we have more time to experiment with more like hydrophobic materials that are more naturally derived. But in this case, I was using 3D printed PLA just so I could get really tight joints to make sure that water wasn't getting inside of my tube. And I tried to give it a more like organic form reference. And for those of you who saw, or those of you who didn't rather, this was my little like citizen science learning tool thing that was supposed to be an accessory to go with my main project. I've been doing some site visits to like children's learning gardens. And I went to one in Brooklyn, and even though it was kind of marketed towards kids, like a lot of the references were very childlike, most people actually using it were adults, which also really struck me that, you know, we're all lifelong learners. And I think especially as we get older, it's really easy to kind of lose sight of all of the wonderful things around us all the time. That's the thing I always find most striking when hanging out with little kids, is just that sense of awe and excitement. So I think that's something really important to me in my work, just how to inspire awe and excitement, especially in the natural world. So this little gadget, you can spin it around and it shows different creatures that you might find while looking through a periscope. Here's kind of the final iteration. And here's another look at some of the things that one might see at just the inside of the wheel that I just showed. But these are all creatures that would be in the saltwater portion of the St. Lawrence River. So not here where we have the freshwater portion, but further down. Yeah, and with that, I will pass it along to Rome.
Thank you. I actually don't have slides up here. Oh, yes, I do. But I'll be reading off of this. So my project is called Bodies of Salt. It was inspired by the water crisis and how we only have about 1%, like access to 1% of fresh water. And the big question is, what are we going to do about that? So I looked into the process of desalinization, which is basically the process of separating sea salt from the water, the seawater, which leaves the salt water becoming fresh water and filtering into a city's supply, and then separates the sea salt, and that becomes a Brin solution that is pumped back into the ocean. And I looked into how this is a bit problematic for the ecosystems and the wildlife that lives in the sea, because normal salt water is 3.7% salt, and Brin is 5%. And so it starts damaging the ecosystems. And I started to look at what we could do with all of this excess salt so that we could minimize the harm, and how we could filter that into design solutions, particularly in construction and also for aesthetics, such as crystallization for sculptures, for fashion. So I looked into salt tiles that have been created by a business called Luma, where they created these tiles from salt marshes in southern France. So there's these metal mesh frames that are submerged in the water, which allow crystals to grow over the course of 2 weeks. The crystal size and color very much vary on the weather conditions. So it could be smaller, bigger, the color changes, but they always come out with a glass-like appearance. And this could replace concrete tiles, glass tiles. They are naturally fireproof, so they're suitable for public spaces, and they were installed in Frank Gehry's airless tower. I also looked into salt bricks, which were developed by Daniel Mandler. So the salt bricks are very straightforward. It's just a mixture of like 95% sea salt and then 5% additional ingredients, which is to improve the stability and of like the water and humidity, sorry. So these have a very low carbon footprint, and they're very sustainable, non-toxic, non-flammable, naturally antibacterial. The research that still needs to be done is how to combat salt corroding the metal and just the density and flexibility of it. And for my own experimentation, we did a workshop in class with bioplastics where I added a bunch of salt, and I saw the result of that was that it crystallized, and it created this beautiful structure, but it was very rigid and I couldn't get it out of the tin. So I started experimenting with if I were to add certain like different types of sea salt, fine versus coarse, and in different amounts, would I be able to create a successful bioplastic? And that is the next steps for this project. I'm going to continue making bioplastics and trying to make my own salt tiles. Thank you.
Thank you, Rome.
So in the last 2 years, I've been working in the field of harm reduction and mainly with drug user and homeless people. In my professional life, which eventually in the last 2 years, I tried to combine with my design practice. So which led to a couple projects, but with this one particularly, I was first interested in looking at the waste created from like drug use and harm reduction. So like the packaging, the syringes, the boxes, everything in which like material for drug use came from. And I was like curious about how I could reuse those material, reuse those waste. But while talking with Alice and with like concern about biohazard and things like that, I decided to go a different route and discuss the stigma about drug use and injection, also of medication. Like as I said, as working in harm reduction, I don't see that much stigma because like the people I work with are all aware and used to that environment, but people outside of it who don't use drugs or don't know people who use drugs might have a lot of misconception or stigma or judgment towards people who do use drugs. Like you can see that just by restaurant putting like black light into the bathroom so to stop people from using drugs in their bathroom, which in the end just cause more death. And also other stigma from like going to the pharmacy asking for needles and the pharmacist is gonna like judge you and question like the validity of you getting needles. So that's why I end up working with the plastic bin that we use to dispose of needles and try to make them something more welcome and less stigmatized. So I work with felt to make some kind of sleeve to go on top of those container, and make those containers look like something that could be in anyone's home, and not something you need to hide or be ashamed of. Because one thing is that obviously some people who use injection either for medication or drug are going to use those containers in their home, but also you might know someone who is going to use drugs or medication in your own home. So having one of those containers that you're not ashamed of owning was like part of my process. I don't remember. So also another part of my project, I still wanted to explore like reusing materials, so using wheat paste glue and do I have it somewhere? Okay, no, I don't have it. I thought that's it, but using wheat paste glue and the cardboard box in which the like needles and other material come from, I made some kind of conceptual sharp disposal boxes. So as like a first iteration of how to use those waste to make something new in this instance, make a new kind of more sustainable sharp disposal container not made of plastic and instead of being made of cardboard. But my project mainly revolves about around making those sleeves out of felt. And like I mainly use water and wool to make them, but also as we can see here, like also using needles to like felt the wool together, which as I was doing it, I realized that the irony of making a sleeve for a box meant to dispose of needles, and I was using a needle for that. Because like if I was to break that needle or poke myself and like bleed on it, I will dispose of it in the same container. So it is like it all end up like circling back to the idea behind it.
Technically, may I ask how you felt something around a box? Purely technical question.
Yeah,
Just, how do you do that?
like
Yeah.
I used 3 slightly different techniques, but the main idea is like it's just a small strip, but it's the same process for all of the boxes. Is you layer a bunch of strand of wool and you layer them like in different direction, and then you just put water with soap and you just massage it, like you roll it and you just until you have like a uniform sheet of wool.
Yeah.
And then I just rolled it around the box, and using the needle, I like very carefully felt it together to close it.
Okay.
And what was like more difficult about it is that the needle is very like brittle.
Yeah.
So usually you're supposed to use it on top of like a sponge or something like that. But just because I didn't have a sponge, the shape of the container,
That's it.
I did on top of the container. So I was very careful to like close the box, like on one edge, and then at the bottom I fold the bottom, and then same thing. I just felt it to close it.
Yeah. Okay, now I understand. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. So this project for me, in the past few years, I've been doing a lot of projects at Concordia with wood, and it's something that I'm sort of planning to get into more formally. After this program, I'm looking at doing like cabinet making certification. So this project served as a way for me to really think about the origin point of this material that I'm seeing myself live with on a daily basis, and use and transform into things that hopefully people really care about. So I spent a lot of like slow thinking, beginning with forests and kind of my relationship with growing up around them, and this new relationship that's beginning where I am using this material more formally. And at the same time, introducing something that is sort of contradictory to this relationship with fire, where it's normally seen as something that is kind of an enemy of wood or destructive of it, it's damaging. But I've become aware of this technique that's common in Switzerland and Japan, where they, for timber cladding on the outside of buildings, they char the surface, and it's like a sort of a natural, traditional weatherproofing treatment. And I wanted to just try that out some way, like through this project. So there was sort of, those were the two like main points where I was starting from, is just like thinking about this material and then this particular technique that I wanted to get into. And it felt really appropriate for me to try to find wood instead of going to a commercial lumber yard and getting timber from, that would have been grown in a tree plantation or somewhere like that. You can get better lumber than that at a lumber yard, but it felt really appropriate for me to go and kind of forage for this particular piece that I could live with for the 3 months that it took to finish this project. So over the reading break, I was in New Brunswick. I was on beaches looking for driftwood and things, and eventually what I found was around the corner of my apartment at Champ des Possibles, there was a tree that they cut down in big sections. So I took one of those sections and brought it home, and I was living with it for a while. I was just sitting in my kitchen, sort of absorbing the character of it. It was like the right height to sit on. It was in the corner. I didn't really know what I was going to do with this for the longest time, so I spent a lot of time just kind of staring at it and taking in the shape of it, which eventually I decided to try to emphasize or keep with the final product. I wanted to preserve the character of this piece of wood, and a lot of that came through, I had trouble getting into the wood shop. I think I would have done something a lot more technical and maybe traditional if I had been in there with the machinery and the technicians. I was initially picturing like turning the legs on a lathe and having like a flat top surface, just like a really kind of basic traditional stool, as an exercise for me to do that for the first time. But in the end, I was like, let's just make this as simple as possible and see what I can do with a few saws. So yeah, I tried to see if there was a sort of a form of a chair that could come out of a solid piece of wood, and spent some time sketching it and kind of drafting it onto the log, and did this entirely by hand. It took a long time. It was tough, but it was satisfying, and it was interesting to see, because the log was whole for a long time, and then there were these phases. Like one day I would do the first series of cuts, and then the second day another, and then the third day the sanding. And then after each day, it was like this new character was appearing, where the previous one is completely gone. Like that first log, the character of that log, not completely gone, because there's some of it still resting in the last object, but the sort of irreversible change was something that I found to be really interesting in this process, and how it was broken down into specific operations. But yeah, and then in the end, did the burning treatment with a torch. And it's still in the process of setting. I'm going to do a few more oiling treatments. It's pretty sooty when you touch it, but in the end, I like it. It's not exactly the geometry I had planned at first, but a lot of that came from doing it by hand. I had to adapt to my skill level with a saw and the shape of the wood and the nature that it had of reacting to cutting in certain directions. So it kind of in the end, a lot of it was decided by itself, and now it has appeared as this sort of object that I didn't really know was going to come out this way, but it's fun to see it here now. And I think that it reflects both the character of its original being, and then it's in something new now, and I'm satisfied with how it's gone.
Thank you, Oliver. Sasha?
Yeah, so I guess my journey with this started a bit less academic. I wanted a guitar.
Do we have pictures? Do you want to show?
No, I don't have pictures actually.
Okay.
It was on purpose almost, because I really believe in like kind of like the materiality speaking for itself in a way, like in person and kind of like seeing it with your own eyes. It's right around the corner if you want to have a look. But yeah, I have some guitars, but I guess I want another one. And they cost a lot of money. So I was looking at some square guitars online, and they're about like $2,000. I was like, I don't want to spend that much money on a guitar, so I said, why not build it myself? And so I did. I collected some materials, kind of more of a kind of rock and roll approach to it. Didn't have any plans drawn out. I just took some wood that I sourced from a local Montreal furniture maker, which I had the chance to kind of explore their facilities and get some tips from them. Brought some donuts and coffee and whatnot. And they sourced me with some kind of scrap wood that was destined for the landfill. And I'm really fond of taking materials that have no more use, or that are just going to kind of pollute the earth, and make something good out of it. So I started with kind of no experience with this, and I kind of just learned on the go and kind of built this thing at my parents' shed in the cold, and with like hand tools and stuff. So it was kind of rough at the start, but the project kind of evolved. I had no kind of expectations of it, didn't know if it was going to work, if it was going to sound anything. So did some experimentations with some scrap wire, really just kind of figuring out the scale of it as well. Yeah, I built a strap. Also, I was shopping for some new jeans during Black Friday. I stopped by the Levi store at the Eaton Center down the street, and I was waiting in line to try them on, and I looked at the garbage can, and there were some scrap denim pieces from cut-offs of jeans that they hem, and I thought that would make a great material to make a strap. So I had a little chat with the hemming man, or whatever you call him, and then he kindly gave them to me, and I kind of MacGyvered something last week in my apartment with a needle. So a lot of the project was kind of going with the flow and kind of just building stuff. And often in projects, I tend to go for a very academic framework, but for this one, I really wanted just the materials to speak, and not me taking the whole room of it and saying, okay, this is me as a designer, I'm making this, it's about me. This was really about the materials. So like the finish of it is just linseed oil, and like the wood is beautiful, and I can't take any credit for that, because unfortunately we don't grow trees, but it's really, really nice material, and just kind of working with these really raw materials in their state was really kind of the process for me to kind of like not force it into a mold, but really letting it speak for itself. And then, for example, like when I cut originally the size was supposed to be bigger based on a mandolin, but my wood piece was not big enough for that, and I didn't want to have to glue stuff together because it's too much work. So I said, you know what, I can just shrink the instrument to fit the piece of wood I have, rather than complicating myself or forcing the material into a mold. So and the thickness again was already cut off. So I was like, okay, why would I shrink it? Why would I, modify it or make it anything? And also the fact that it's square saves a lot of materials, because often guitars are rounded and they waste a lot of excess material on the sides, which creates more kind of wood to the landfill. So I said to make it square, so you can kind of just like make cakes out of it and just kind of cut them in straight lines. So yeah, I'm quite happy with the process, and I think I would probably want to make some more later on. Yeah, it sounds quite interesting. It actually tunes like a viola. I didn't know what it was going to sound like, so once it was done, I was really excited to tune it. I have my app, and I put the ukulele setting on it because that's the closest to it, what it is, and it didn't work at all. And so then I went to banjo, that didn't work. I went to guitar, that didn't work. I was like, what the heck is this instrument? And so I just said, okay, it can't be a violin. So I just put it on viola setting, and it actually worked. So I guess it would sound closer to a kind of a viola. I would have to make a bow for it, I guess, as well. And it's really interesting. They're actually baritone ukulele strings. I purchased the wrong ones. I guess I was distracted or whatever. I picked the first one off the rack. And only while I was tuning it was I realizing that the gauge of the string is too thick for the instrument, where it could probably handle the tension of that. But I just kind of went with the flow and said, instead of returning it at Jean Talon, I decided to just put it on, and then it turned out what it is. So
It's a one of a kind.
exactly.
Yeah. Did you
Yes.
bring it to a, how do you say in English, un luthier?
Luthier?
Oh,
Luthier, yeah, same
yeah.
thing. I really want to,
Yeah.
and it's something I have a much more deeper appreciation for the craft, because it's, of course, it was a bit ambitious to think I would figure it out in one semester, and it's nowhere near the level of a master luthier who spent decades working on it. And this future exploration, I would love to be able to work with those people who have this experience and perhaps make more affordable instruments, because in a sense, this one is free. And when you're thinking of purchasing an instrument, it's very expensive. And often it's made abroad in like Asia, for example, and using like cheap labor, which is not nice. But with the cheap materials, you're able to actually pay people properly because you're cutting off the material costs. So I think as a future kind of tangible outcome for this project would be to make them for all the kids who want to learn how to play instruments, but don't want to spend $2,000 out of their piggy bank. So yeah.
All right. So, okay, I'm going to go a little out of order here. So, when I started this project, my goal was to examine ways of looking at urban infrastructure. Specifically, I was looking at tiles and bricks and asking how can we use the geometries afforded by digital fabrication, like 3D printing, to create what are called like bioresilient interfaces where more than human organisms can grapple on and be well situated and kind of like make a home there. There's a lot of material questions that come along with that. But with my background in digital fabrication, I started experimenting with just basic clay 3D printing at the start and quickly realized through a form finding process that tiles were much more complicated to make than they should be on these printers. There's a lot of them are spiralized with these printers, and that's in part because the way when the material is laid down, if it's going against the grain, it will pull because they're wet and they stick together. So when tiles are being made, because they're not spiralized and they have complex geometries that are small, it pulls on the filament and it gets all messy and it quickly turns into muck. So I started looking at how I could kind of capture the essence of what I wanted to do, and I found other researchers that had basically created PLA molds that made tiles similar to what I was trying to do. But having a background in digital fabrication, that wasn't really aligned with my learning goals because I knew how to print molds PLA. So I wanted to ask different questions. So how could I create these more than human interfaces working with geometries that were spiralized on these printers? So this is like the base print that I did, and that's the one that turned into the moss wall. But what I was looking at doing instead is when you're propagating moss, there's like not a specific one solution fits all way to do it. The most common way you can find online is this thing called like the buttermilk method, for people who do moss graffiti. They blend moss in a blender with buttermilk and then they like paint it on surfaces. One, in an inside setting, it's a little bit gross. It can smell quite quickly. If it rains, that washes away, and often these are mosses that are meant for like rock surfaces, which are much smaller and take a really long time to grow. And when I was reflecting on moss as kind of this boundary organism that rehabilitates environments, mosses, like along riverbeds, for instance, spores will land there and they'll germinate and they'll be very sparse and a lot of success and failure over time. But over the generations, their growth and their death creates kind of a woven mat of these moss rhizoids, which is like a net that can capture other organisms. And that's how soil is slowly formed. So even though the final product had a bit of moss in it, it was acting as a way to kind of capture other organisms. And I'll explain what I mean by that. But this picture here is a second biomaterial on top of the clay. So this is a mixture of clay and ground down wood pulp with lots of water. And the reason I did this was because if you want to put something on the exterior of the ceramic surface, the exterior surface, basically you're putting, it needs to be wet, and these are unfired ceramics. So if you get them too wet, they start to lose form and collapse on themselves. But if you just use clay, one, it dries out very quickly, making the process harder, and two, it can suffocate the moss. It doesn't have a lot of breathing room. So when you make a mixture with like the sawdust, if this was on an exterior wall and there are parts of the moss embedded in it, when it rains, it's able to take in moisture and breathe, allowing the moss to grow a bit more without actually like the structural integrity of the inside geometry that's supporting it collapsing in on itself. So there's kind of a breathing space in there. And that is something I thought of when I was looking at some research on bioconcrete, and people were doing forms similar to this, where they would have basically a type of clay and they would drop microbial organisms that binded the clay together, but the most efficient way had like a staggered approach where there was airflow into it, because you still need airflow to circulate to the roots of the plant and throughout. So basically I created a mixture, coated that around the pockets in the 3D print, and then kind of gently broke up all the moss by hand to be single-stranded. They come in clumps, but they're actually like single strands that have kind of root-like hairs. So I was gently put them on the side after coating it, and that involved a very slow process of also dotting it with the solution in different areas and gently putting them in. But the more you try to perfect it, the harder it gets, because every time you put water on there, it increases the likelihood that other moss is going to fall off when you loosen the sediment. So in like my final motive for this is like, I was thinking about it in terms of, is this kind of like bypassing or cheating my original goal of like wanting a surface to host moss and other organisms? But then when I was thinking back on that like river analogy that I had read in the book Gathering Moss, I was thinking of this as providing kind of a helping hand, and like this organism is a co-collaborator in a sense, where it'll be able to grow and the roots will form kind of a ring that will support the structure of it while also hosting other organisms. So it still does what I wanted to do with the tiles. It just was a very pivoted approach based on material constraints and the learning process of it. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Matt. You can keep the microphone. We'll see where it goes after. Thank you so much for all those super rich detail and those insights into making and practice and the whys and the hows. This is something we don't have access to all the time, so it's really interesting and really rich. I think that I want to highlight something that I found like was a kind of common thread between all of you, and I think that Oliver mentioned it. I've been living with it for a while. I cited you. So you've been living with it for a while, with the coastal Maine, the seashore, salt. You think about fresh water, but it's not like we don't have any salt around us with snow removal and those snow mountains. You've been living with it on your boots and your food. You've been living with salt. It's coming from your work. And I mean, your log, that's the powerful example. I mean, it's been living with you for a while too. And same thing, you had this kind of pile of wood and you were like, okay, what the hell am I gonna do with that? And I know that you have a long-standing relationship with moss, if we can say so, because it's been a recurrent theme in different projects. Okay.
On top of that, that moss has been sitting in my house for over a year that I gathered from a forest that was behind my house when I grew up, and it has now been plowed down. So I was just holding on to it, and there wasn't a sentimental purpose of using that moss, but it has been living with me for a while, my whole life in a way.
So I find it really interesting. It has been living with me, and I've been living with it. So you really created I mean, it's not even metaphorical. It's a real cohabitation with things. It's part of your job every day. It's part of your past, and it's part of your daily life. Although you refer to remote events. Okay. So I'm wondering, what is the importance in your work, and why is it important for you as a designer? And you can answer in any order, to live with it or to start from your own embodied experience or lived experience. Because we can think about situatedness in the way the first group presented it, site-specific. You work with a site, you harvest from the material. But you can also think about it in terms of temporal engagement and the necessity to have embodied the thing in your own life. So can you expand on that? Why is it important to know your subject matter from within?
I guess I'll start and pass it down, but one practical answer to that for me is that, yeah, I have worked with moss a lot in the past, and moss paradoxically grows almost anywhere. Almost impossible to cultivate in lab settings. I had a moss greenhouse for a couple years where I was trying to propagate moss in my apartment, and yeah, it does not like that. I tried many different things. It's very difficult to actually get it to grow, and part of that might partially come from in urban environments. It pops up in places where the conditions are already right, and it's sustained there. But once removed from those conditions, you have to kind of listen to it to know what it needs, and that kind of informed the way that I built the moss wall example, because I knew what it was looking for in its host material, basically, and what kind of moisture constraints and breathability and things like this it needed. And I wouldn't have really known that if I just gathered it and went to prototype right away. So after iterations, I've learned kind of how to design with it a little better. Yeah.
I think in my case, it's a lot about honesty of materials, where sometimes you're surrounded by a lot of things that aren't necessarily what they say they are, for example. So mine was very raw to the basics of what it is. And when I look at it now, I look at the back of the instrument, it doesn't say made in wherever. Well, actually, it doesn't say anything really because I didn't etch it, but in theory, it would say made in Montreal.
Yeah.
And I think that's really powerful, because then it's okay, I know exactly where it comes from, exactly where this is, sourced. And that kind of becomes in a way, also kind of part of a lifestyle. Purifies just the lines of what I'm living along, where I'm aware of what's coming in, what's coming out, and where it kind of originates from. And also, if I'm being completely honest, I was also looking for something that would fit in my apartment quite nicely, and kind of having something that would be able to stay there without me looking at it being like, oh, another school project. It was very important. So now I'm very happy with the aesthetic of it, so it will sit on a shelf and
You're
very, very nice.
recorded, huh? You
Oh,
know that?
oops. Sorry, Concordia.
I think that when you live with what you're working with, or you work with what you're living with, something you're around a lot, naturally it's personal, and making your work personal can be pretty effective in getting you to do a good job or really take it seriously while learning about yourself. And it can just be really motivating, I find, when you make the right choices to stick to something that you feel like you care about. And it's a good exercise as well, because when you get really personal, often it can be, there comes a point where it's abstracted to an outward viewer, and to keep practicing on translating your ideas to that audience, I think is a good way to balance making things personal and working with what you live with, and making it something that can be received by everyone else.
But just on that note, before we pass the mic to Ellie, I find it interesting because between you and Sasha, you work by assembly and addition. You work by reduction. So you removed part of your logs and you added piece of wood together. And it's both very engaged in terms of process, but were you stressed when you were removing wood? Because you can't go back.
Yeah.
There's no Command Z.
Sort of what I was getting at earlier. Like, yeah,
Doesn't exist.
every operation that I did was, there's no coming back from this. So the shape in the end was a culmination of those like unchangeable
Decision.
strikes against this thing. Yeah, decisions. And I never really put it together and thought of it entirely like that. But yeah, this came out of reducing things. Like even that piece to begin with was just a piece of an entire tree. So I kind of followed that through to the end.
And Sasha, were you able to make adjustments in your instruments?
Yeah, to continue on the path of honesty, I actually cracked it at one point,
Yeah.
where I was not careful and I hammered it too hard and it broke. And I didn't want to start from the end, so I was able to make some tweaks, add some glue, add some wood filler, and kind of like recover it as well. Like sometimes the dimensions weren't working, and I was following this idea that it had to be like a real instrument until I realized that this is completely custom, so I have 100% freedom on what it looks like or the dimensions and stuff. So it was very flexible.
Yeah.
In that point, there was no point where I was like, I've done something that's not undoable. So yeah.
Okay. Eli, if we go back to this question of living with
The basic idea of living with it, with that project, a little bit like the log. I spent like the last 2 weeks living with the felt in my living room on a drying rack. Like every day I will work on it, put it back on the rack, waiting for it to dry, and be able to work the day after. So like I've been living with that, and I just have a big mountain of ball of wool on my couch right now. So I've been living with like sitting in the couch, but also having wool next to me. So there's that part. But also, you mentioned my job, but what is interesting to me is that the reason I was able to get that job to begin with is because I'm a person that has experience with injecting medication, hormones, but also have injected drugs before, which is one of the reasons I got my job. Instead of relying on me having social work diploma or something like that, they relied on me having actual lived experience. And now I'm able to work with people who live with the similar things as I lived and still live with. So like, not only like do I work with those kind of boxes, but I also have those boxes in my own home because I need to discard needles every week. So it's like, I've been living with that for years now. So it's like integral part to it. I think it, in one way, it like makes me, it can help makes me like an expert of the subject, which in this case, for example, I think can like reduce the like time spent on like research of like understanding, like for example, in my project, like the stigma around it, because I know about it from experience, but at the same time, starting a project with that idea that you already know about it can lead to assumption, uh, or also bias of just like I know what I want to do. I know what I want to end up with, which can be useful, but also can stop you from exploring something. Another project I did before was a tactile map for blind people, and knowing nothing about the visual impairment, I made a lot of mistake, including like assuming that one specific blind person was able to read Braille, and other assumption like that, because I was not an expert in that, and I'm still not. But by working on that kind of project, I was able to learn, and now I'm more equipped to keep going on
Yeah.
without having like preconceived idea of like what people need for accessibility, because I know nothing about it. So when I'm working on that project, I'm having to learn every like step of the way, versus this project where it's like a lot of it's based on my knowledge and assumption. Like I still had to learn to work on with felt, because I knew a little bit, but still had to learn more. But yeah.
Yeah. I have follow-up questions, but we'll let Rome discuss and Elena too.
Yeah, I think it's really important to draw from your passions. With this class, we got pretty much free rein to research into any material that we wanted to. And I have this, I guess, big list of, I guess you could say, world problems that I want to try to solve. And one of them is the water crisis. And I knew that I wanted to work with water and kind of around that subject. And then through researching desalinization and just more into it, it led me to salt, specifically sea salt. And then, as you said, I started realizing how much salt is around me in general, like table salt, for example, or the salt that we put on the street to break the ice. And I just realized that this concept of, oh, there's excess salt, what do we do about it? That's more close to home than I realized. And that kind of even furthered my interest in researching it. And something I also just thought about was that at the beginning of my career at Concordia, I was very set in wanting to be like an industrial designer, just kind of had like a very straightforward path. And we did bioplastic workshops where I thought that it was interesting, but I guess there was a part of me that wasn't paying like very close attention to it, because I was like, well, I already know what I want to do. And this year in particular, I realized that I wanted to explore more. And I started looking at the things that I had done in class already and had been exposed to. And so I realized that I could experiment with bioplastics, which is something that I never really considered before. So it goes along with this concept of it was always right in front of me and closer to home than I thought. And I think that's kind of a nice like full circle moment for me.
And because it's winter soon. I'm looking at my imaginary watch. It's winter. But looking at like, the relationship between like snow deposit and leakage and impact on soil and fresh water, because you have those snow deposit near the St. Lawrence River, would be super interesting. Like the link, the porous boundary between salty snow deposit next to freshwater
Agreed.
sources.
Yeah, there was so many directions I could have taken
Yeah.
this project. I
Oh,
felt
yeah.
like I needed to specify, but I was like, I wanted to look into how to make like batteries with salts
Oh, yeah.
and just, there was a wide world of things I could have researched and have interest in researching further soon.
Elena.
Okay, so mine is, it's interesting to think about this living with, because I spent much of my childhood living next to and alongside the coast, and I spent a lot of time on floating docks, which is kind of where I was intending this object to be contextualized within. But I think so much of the inspiration for the project was the desire to live with, the anemones and the shrimp and like all of these beautiful, wonderful non-human entities existing in these underwater worlds that I physically cannot live with. It's like a desire to live with. Yeah, I think personally, I grew up swimming, but I'm not the best swimmer. I struggle with the breath stuff, and I just obviously would love to be a mermaid and spend time in these worlds. But I think that's so much of the allure to me, is how it's so unknown. You know how they say like the deep depths of the ocean are like more undiscovered than outer space. And I think there's such a human connection also to this. I have some heart stuff, and I learned at the doctor that we have this thing called the diving reflex, which is on our forehead. If you like put a cool compress on your forehead, it slows down your heart rate. And they think that that's from when we like evolved from marine mammals. It's why it's called the diving reflex. Like when you enter the water and you feel the cool temperature change, it actually signals to your body to like slow your heart rate down. Which I just find so fascinating, like thinking of evolution and the fact that we're so connected to all of these creatures that seem so foreign and alien to us. So I think just when conceptualizing living with, I would love to live with. But I can't, so I'm gonna try to make my little doodads and fun exploratory things so I can get closer to living with.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah, great. Next step. Before asking the next question, because I have 10,000 questions, anyone has a comment or question for the group? Yes, Kato.
Yeah, I had a question about expectation in the process of making. A couple of you mentioned that you sort of began this project with one method or a number of methods in mind for how you were going to complete the project. I think I'm specifically thinking about the two wood projects, but I'm sure all of your methods changed throughout the process. I'm wondering how that changes the way that you look at the process as a whole, but also how it changes the way that you look at the finished object or objects that you've created. If I think of the chair, for instance, like going on your own sort of on your own expertise when it comes to woodworking, rather than relying on a shop with equipment that you wouldn't otherwise have. Whether it could be like a sense of pride that you feel when you look at the object and you sort of see a degree of like self-reliance in it, or any other sort of, I don't know, just a change in how you see both the process and the finished sort of product.
I think in the end, with this object being the way it is, I feel a lot more exposed in it, as opposed to something that I would have got a lot of aid from an expert making and learning these like time-tested techniques. There's this thing that I'm not sure, well, it's not on the slides anymore, but I'm not sure anyone else would have come up with this thing. Like it's a weird shape, but yeah, I didn't see it coming, and that was really interesting. I don't know, I want to keep thinking about this question. I don't know if you have anything to say.
In regards to expectations, I'm really glad I didn't work with a luthier. Because when you're building something that people have been doing for hundreds, thousands of years, there's these kind of expectations of how things are supposed to be done. And that's why usually when I do projects, I usually actually don't really refer to experts because it lets me kind of screw up in a way that I can learn about something rather than being forced or guided the whole way, or like being like, what is it in English, like tenu la main? What is it, held hand? Hand holding, whatever. Or having training wheels where like I'm just kind of like off in the deep blue with kind of no idea and it's okay to screw up. So I think that's been really fun to be able to just explore and screw up. And there's thousands of mistakes in that build. And luckily enough, I don't think people have noticed, but yeah.
I'd be curious to hear Matt around that question because you're working with 3D printing. There's a lot of behind the scenes that we don't see, and it seems that, there's a control of the machine that you need to acquire in order to make that shape. And the number of big mountains of formless clay I made in the lab, I mean, it's countless. I know what it is, and I know like trial and error is embedded in working with that. So how do you negotiate expectations? Because you kind of reached a kind of perfected form in a way to grow the moss on it, but it's not like you could necessarily just do whatever shape. You're tied to the machine. So can you speak about that?
Yeah, it's it's an interesting mix because there was a bit of disappointment in it because I was putting a lot of time into like, okay, how can I make these tiles or bricks? And then I was making progress on the digital side of the pipeline. Like you need to model it, you need to slice it, which is like preparing the 3D model for your printer. You need to consider when slicing it, like how fast does it come out? How much material is coming out? What's the gauge of the material? How fast does it dry? Consistency, etc. I did have some background knowledge with ceramic printing to draw on, but I quickly found out that like I had never actually tried to make something that was like square in shape, and for some reason that was a big issue, which threw like a huge wrench in my plans. But in a way, it was like necessity breeds innovation, where I would have never kind of come up with this moss wall, this way of like creating a multi-material symbiotic interface if I wasn't kind of trying to like turn this idea in my head of like, what's my end goal? How do I reach this more than human collaborative design? And if I were to just try and sketch something like that out from the start, I wouldn't have really thought of it because, yeah, the material, the form kind of dictated the direction. I was fortunate to not have too many failures on the ceramic side of it, but that's because I also knew what to avoid. And I think the moisture content was like a big thing where I was like, when this dries, is all the moss just gonna like fall out? Because that can happen if the consistency's not right. But I think it was just like to just keep trying and see what comes of it. But I'm happy with the end result. And what's the last thing I would say on that is, I guess, yeah, it's an ongoing process. So it's like not like I have this final thing in mind and then it's like it's either is or it isn't. Because now it's like, now that I have one thing done, my next step would be like, okay, put some of these out in the wild or in parks, etc., and see how resilient is the material, what kind of organisms get collected, etc. So I think thinking of it as process is helpful in that regard.
Yeah. I think there's a microphone you need to use, PK.
So I'm really interested. Is it working?
Yeah.
In the concept of water and liquids, and I mean, it's because yes, the process, the materiality and everything is interesting, but I'm wondering, the interest in water, salt, and then the interest in play and fantasy and being in the water. It, it really, did you find that you had some connection between each other when you were working? Or, because I find a conceptual relationship to those two works that could be really developed just in terms of conversation, not in making, but in terms of directions and places, especially around water, which is so important for creatures, plants, humans, every living creature.
I was going to say, to be honest, we weren't super looped into each other's projects during the design phase. I wish we had been. Would have been fun to collaborate and discuss that a bit more. Yeah, I guess just thinking, so is your main question like how our projects relate?
Play and floating and dreaming and experience,
Yeah.
whereas you're going to save the world, because if we don't, pollution, salt, lack of fresh water. So it's all about water, but the way you approach it, from serious to playfulness, it just seems as though there is a natural liaison that could unfold to combine paths that are more relational. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, I think for me, the aspect of play and exploration, and also just like increasing exposure to these wonderful natural phenomenon is so important to me. I think it's one of the most effective things that you can do to kind of create empathy and engagement. I was working briefly in kind of like behavioral science, and we were actually working on cigarette butt litter, and we found that, which was also for waterways in San Francisco, a lot of cigarette butts were being washed into the ocean, and we were trying to figure out how to change that human behavior. And one of the most effective design interventions we did was gamification of the cigarette butt receptacles. So we made it like, vote for your favorite soccer team with your cigarette butt. And it was like in a transparent case, so you could see how many people had voted by disposing their cigarette butt there. So I think I don't get the word gamification feels kind of like annoyingly from the marketing sphere or something, but I think it just kind of hints at this greater sort of fascination that we all have with playfulness and curiosity and kind of engaging with things in a different way that's like purely intellectual and clinical. So I think after doing that work, that kind of really demonstrated to me how important it is to make things engaging and playful in a different way. Would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think, honestly, what comes to mind is just balance. Like, I think I have a very sometimes black and white literal way of thinking. So my project ended up kind of very like serious and very straightforward, and yours is very like playful and fun. And I really like the kind of dynamic between our two projects, and how I think from everyone in this room, I've been very inspired today, and specifically from your project, I'm thinking, how can I maybe make my project more playful, but more so just take inspiration from the lightness of your project and add it to mine. And yeah, I think that's my thoughts.
Thank you both. Any other comment, question? Yes, Hish.
I guess it's more of a general question for all of you. I was thinking about symbiotic futures, and it's in plural form, so it's not this singular future. But what does it mean for you, this symbiotic future? I'm sorry, it's very general, but
That's very, it's a hard question at 4:30.
yeah, I think it's like because you mentioned living with is one, but like living with the material, making with the material, being near something. But what does the symbiosis mean in the sense, this practice of, I mean, we didn't really talk about sustainability that we talked about like yesterday, but yeah.
I think pretty simply in this context, it's a lot to do with respecting where your materials come from and trying to use them in a way that is sort of natural to them and then considers where they end up. And yeah, while you're working with them, trying to make sure that it's worth doing what you're doing with them. I know it's pretty general, but I feel like that kind of covers it from a material perspective.
Just on the note of you bringing up the plural, not specifically future, one thing that I align with in that is in my background, I've done a lot of research in sustainable technologies, and there's kind of this mentality I see a lot of like, not necessarily solutionism, but a little bit this. It's just like over every field can kind of present their work as like, this is this singular thing that will like change the landscape and change how we do things. And I was doing a lot of research about sustainable technologies back in the 70s, and I saw a lot of mentality about that was much more communal centric and system centric. And I found that really fascinating, where I was looking at solar, and maybe because of how much less power they could generate back then, but pairing them with different systems, like how can the waste products of one feed into the other? And how can we look at it from a systems approach and build to help each other with weaknesses and gaps in the system? So I think that is, with the plurality of futures for me, I align with that in that way.
One of the way that I see the, like symbiotic futures is the potentiality of multiple futures. Like with all of the projects, like depending what we're doing, we can create different futures. Like with the salt, like the salt, it's like depending what you do with it, it's like you can create a different future. But also, if you make a different decision, it's gonna be another different future also. But the symbiotic part, I think, for all of our project is like to work with others. Like for myself, it's like like having a symbiosis between like drug user and non-drug user for a better future for both kind of people, but also symbiosis between the material, like the plastic and the felt, and like the material that make those boxes. Like I'm trying to imagine a future where like they will be more sustainable. Yeah, for example.
I find it also interesting when you're making things on your own, how much you realize that the process is a lot simpler than you'd expect, or that perhaps in the industrial processes, they're really like no excuse for the amount of pollution that's being created. For example, when I was building the fretboard, I was inserting kind of the frets, the metal pieces that go in the neck. And traditionally you would use like super glue, which is really not environmentally friendly. And building it kind of would have been the standard, but instead I realized, well, I can just not use glue at all and just cut a hole and knock it in, and there you go. I saved the planet, just as simply as that. So I think by building things, you're kind of raising your own awareness about how, as a designer, especially as students, and going into the field later, how much change can be done with just simple decisions like that. Where I could not single-handedly, but we could single-handedly shut down the super glue kind of economy, which would be kind of great actually. So
That's a, yeah, good plan for the future.
I am in the design program, and the overarching question in that program is basically how do we move forward in a sustainable way, to put it simply. And for my project, I have a background in environmental design and architecture, and that's why I wanted to focus specifically on construction materials and tiles and bricks specifically, to see how I could tackle this issue of excess salt and implement it in a way for aesthetics, but also specifically like construction methods and like design solutions. And I also think, I guess my philosophy as a designer and also just a person is like, how can I do better every single day? I know that sounds very cheesy, but that's really like what it boils down to. I feel like, so when I think about futures, it's just how can I, as a designer, make something that is useful and going to help either myself, my peers, or a greater community.
Yeah, I think the title just generally kind of refers to how we all introduced our projects, and Alice was like, whoa, the thing that's striking me is you all talked about living with, which is, I think, like at the root of the word symbiotic. Like, how can we live with and mutually support different entities? So, and then futures, plural, is just that there's infinite ways that we could do that. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, Elena. I think it's a nice concluding remark. I wish we could continue forever this discussion. However, time flies, and we will have to wrap up. However, I have many, many burning questions that I will ask you after, and I invite the public to do the same and mingle with us while we, unset the exhibition and stay in the space with us for further discussion, further dialogue. I want to thank this group today, like second roundtable, first roundtable. It was an absolute pleasure to work with you throughout the whole semester, and yesterday too, of course. I hope everyone listens on Zoom, everyone's here. It's teaching this class is always, all students spoke about risk-taking and so on. It's also a risk for me because we never know what to expect. There is a framework, but where are we going? It really depends on how students engage together and individually. And teaching this class is a way to learn from you as much as we learn together. So I want to thank you, yesterday's group, today's group, Fourth Space. It's always amazing. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you to everyone for coming into Fourth Space today, also yesterday. Thank you for activating these conversations, for your questions, for your installations, for your insights. This was fantastic. We're going to go ahead, close up the Zoom and the live stream now, but a quick reminder that this conversation is available on our YouTube channel if you wish to revisit or share it. If you're here in the space, please feel free to check out the expo. It is on until I think about 5:45 today, so please enjoy. And we hope to see you here again at Fourth Space.